All right, here we go. So one more day of this sugya. So maybe before we go ahead, so what we basically have left is we want to answer the questions on Rashi, right? You guys remember this? Ring a bell?
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe we should just review quickly what we said yesterday because it's going to be somewhat relevant to the stuff that we discussed today. Anybody want to take a stab at just summarizing how we answered the questions on the Rambam?
Or for number 3,
Yeah,
the
go for
question with why is it separated? Why does it separate Lulav from the other 3 minim? It's because it has the other 3 minim have both Gavra and Hefta to it, and Lulav doesn't really have the Hefta part.
Okay.
Because when a Lulav disintegrates or it dries out,
Right.
it stays full and doesn't crumble.
Right.
You could tell it's a Lulav. But the other 3, they crumble and you can't really tell it's the 3 minim. That's why both. That's why it also separates it.
Right. So conceptually, both the Lulav and the other 3 minim have both
Gavra and
the requirement of the Gabra of Hiddur and the Psul and the Chefza of Hiddur.
Yeah.
But Lulav is just
Lulav.
not manifested.
Yeah, it doesn't manifest with Lulav.
Right.
And number 4, it's what was the question?
That was the question of how could it be that in a Shas Hadchak, all of a sudden,
If
just because he can't find one, now it's no longer a disqualified entity.
it's also it's a thing to din in the Gabra.
Right.
He
So
has
by
to go out of his
Lulav,
way- Lulav, he has to go out of his way to find the beautiful Lulav. If not, if he has a dry one, it's fine.
Right. Well, it's okay because as long as the Gabra did the best he could, then he's okay. And if he can't help it, then he still did the best he could. Right? That's what you're saying. Okay, good. Right. Good job. Solid. The one thing I want to clarify, it was very good. One thing I want to clarify that I think I should have made clearer yesterday, and it's one of the points that you mentioned, is that by the other 3, by not Lulav, right, by Esrog and Hadas and Arava. So I'm not regarding the Psul and the Chefza, right? So we said that the Psul and the Chefza exists theoretically, right, like conceptually, by all 4 minim, but by Lulav it can't manifest whereas by the other 3 it can. So it's not exactly. I'm not saying exactly that it's because when they dry out, like they no longer have their integrity altogether. Like they completely crumble and they're gone. Because if that were the case, it wouldn't be that it's a problem of Hiddur, it would just be a problem that the Arava just isn't there anymore, like if the leaves aren't there. But what I mean is that by Esrog and Hadas and Arava, it's not necessarily the case that when it dries out, the leaves just crumble immediately, but because they're so susceptible to like just crumbling away, like as if they're like nothing, they're so brittle, and by the esrog, because it's so shriveled, the esrog is still there, and the leaves are still there, but because they're so brittle and shriveled, it's like really the chefza is not physically totally ruined, but basically there is an element of ruination of the chefza, like it's basically been messed up. Not that it's gone, it's still there, but the chefza is like really messed up. Whereas by the lulav, it's still solid, it still has its integrity, it's not like about to disintegrate or crumble away. So there, like the integrity of the entity isn't compromised in the same way. You know what I'm trying to say? I'm just trying to clarify that one point. You get what I'm saying? Yaakov?
Yeah.
Yeah, David? Mm-hmm. Yeah? Okay. Alright, so I just wanted to make that clarification. Alright, but the summary was very good. Alright, so basically now we're left with Rashi. Okay, so we had 2 questions. They were Tosfos' 2 questions on Rashi. And they were both regarding Rashi's source. For the halacha that lulav has to be or can't be dry, right? So Rashi said the source was the pasuk of. You guys remember the pasuk of?
Paper. Zekeli
Vanvehu, good, right? And Tosfos said, how can you say the source is Zekeli Vanvehu? Problem number 1 is that the Gemara itself says that the source is not that pasuk, but rather the pasuk of Kriyas Hadar, right? By this specific mitzvah. That's problem number 1. And problem number 2, if you want to tell me that the requirement for Hiddur by Lulav is due to Zekeli Vanvehu, let's look around at the halacha of Zekeli Vanvehu in the Torah in general, and we see that halacha, the requirement to try to get, to try to do mitzvahs in a way that's beautiful, that's only a requirement lecha tchila, right? And b'di'eved, if you don't beautify your mitzvahs in general, and kol HaTorah kula, so it's okay. It's only something you have to try to do lecha tchila. So Tosfos says, so how could it be over here that all of a sudden you're telling me that the source of requiring a beautiful lulav is Zekeli Vanvehu, and the Mishnah makes it very clear that requirement is a posel, and if you don't do it, then it's possible even b'di'eved. How can that be true if in the whole Torah, the whole rest of the Torah, the requirement of something beautiful is only the chachila, and now here all of a sudden somehow it becomes a requirement that disqualifies it, that makes it problematic even b'di'eved. Right? You guys remember the questions? Okay. So you guys have any thoughts about answering up Rashi, or not really? No?
Well,
Ask it again.
Is Rashi saying that we wouldn't learn from Pri HaTorah, we wouldn't learn Chavtza and Gavra from Pri HaTorah?
Okay.
That's why he brings in Zekeli Ve'avehu. That would teach us. That could teach us Gavra and Chavtza.
Okay. So you're saying, what are you suggesting?
I'm saying that he's going against not going against, but he's saying that we don't learn it out from Pri HaTorah. We learn it out from different pasuk, really.
We learn out the halacha not from Pri HaTorah, because Pri HaTorah you're saying wouldn't teach you Gavra and Chavtza.
Or maybe it is. Maybe it's just teaching us one thing.
Okay.
Maybe the other
Esrog
pasuk.
gets Chasa B'Lulav doesn't.
Well, say it again?
Maybe because Esrog gets Chasa B'Lulav doesn't manifest Chasa, Rashi wants to stay away from that comparison.
Well, one second. Are you guys saying the same thing or different things? Hold on.
Probably different.
Different. Okay, so let me just finish with what Tamir was saying, and then we'll jump to what Yaakov was saying. So what are you proposing, Tamir? That Pri HaTorah
Only teaches us, let's say, one thing. Or
only teaches one thing, or doesn't teach us anything, but not. You mean when you say one thing, you mean one thing of the two of Chefza and Gavra.
Yeah, probably.
But not the other.
Yeah.
And he brings in
Zekeli Ve'avehu to teach the other
to
thing.
teach you the other thing. Okay, so is he disagreeing with the Gemara when it says that the source is Pri HaTorah?
I don't think he's disagreeing. I think he's just saying that there's something extra that the Gemara didn't bring in, really.
So the Gemara is not untrue. It's just not referring to everything that's the source.
Probably, yeah.
That's how you're trying to answer that question.
That's what I'm trying to go with for number one.
Okay, and then in terms of the question of it being a problem even b'di'evad, is there a way out of that one?
I don't know.
Okay.
I didn't think about that yet.
Okay. All right. Think about that question. All right. I hear the approach you're trying to take. It's not bad. Think about that question. You understand what I'm asking about how you're trying to approach it? Meaning, you tell me that it's. Where do you think I got to put this? Hold on one second. So you're saying that it's the psul and the chefza is from Pri HaTorah, and the requirement of the Gavra is from Zekeli Ve'avehu. Is that what you're saying?
Basically, that might be the gist of it.
All right, hold that thought. All right, yeah, go ahead.
What I said is very similar to that. Perhaps because the Esrog, or the din Esrog, is also Chasa and Lulav, does not have the manifested din of Chasa, Rashi wanted to stay away from drawing the comparison from Esrog.
Rashi wants to stay away from say it again?
Drawing the comparison from Esrog, or Pri HaTorah. Because
Okay.
it expresses the din of Chasa.
So he wanted to stay. Okay, well, let's think about this. So you're saying he wanted to stay away from the pasuk of Pri HaTorah because that's a pasuk by Esrog, and we learn out Lulav from it, right?
Yeah.
So you want to stay away from that because then you would think that the din in the chefza is being carried over.
Yeah.
But bottom line, is that pasuk something that teaches you the halacha of Hadar?
Not for Chasa.
Not for chesed by Lulav, you mean?
Yeah.
And yet the Gemara says that we learn out the requirement for Hidr by Lulav from that pasuk. Right? The Gemara says that the Hayavesh is a problem by Lulav because we learn out that you need Pri HaTorah from Esrog.
Right.
Right? So he's saying Rashi's trying to kind of steer you away from that, but it seems like the Gemara itself was doing that.
Uh-huh. Right.
But according to you, are you basically then, let me just explore what you're saying a little further. Are you basically then saying, similar to what Tamir is saying, that in terms of the chefza, Rashi didn't want to use that pasuk because that draws you into sort of the psul and the chefza, but the phenomenon of the gavra, it learns that from a different pasuk, from Zekeli Ve'avehu?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, let's think about that for a second. 'Cause I think that's a good approach. I do. But let's think about it for a minute, just try to explore it. Right, so let me ask you a question regarding what you guys are saying, because I think it's a good approach, and it's the approach that I want to take also, basically. But I think it has to be we have to sharpen it up a little bit, okay? But I think it is a good approach. So what we're basically going to try to say is that Rashi is bringing in the pasuk of Zekeli Ve'avehu over here, because like Tamir and Yaakov are both basically saying that in concept, in potential, in theory, Lulav, remember that this mission that we've been dealing with, where these Rashis were written, is regarding Lulav specifically, right? Not regarding Esrog and Hadas and Arava. The Mishnayos about those come later. Okay, so we're going to suppose that Rashi holds like the Rambam, and we're going to say that here when Rashi brings in the pasuk of Zek Heliv Anvehu by Lulav specifically, it's because by the other three minim, and really by Lulav also, in potentially you have the halacha of the psul and the chefza, but it's not manifest, it's not actualized by Lulav, as we've said a few times over the last few days. So therefore, what you guys are proposing is that it would be inappropriate to bring in the pasuk of Priyei Tadar, because that's really a pasuk about the psul in the chefza more, right? That's what you're saying? So instead, Rashi brings in the pasuk of Zek Heliv Anvehu, because that refers to the psul in the gavra. That's basically what you're saying. So here are the elements that I think we need to kind of sharpen up about that idea. Element number one is like this. It's a little strange, then, that Rashi brings in a pasuk about sort of a general Torah principle and requirement of Zek Heliv Anvehu regarding this specific mitzvah, right? I'm basically saying that we still need to address Tosfos' other question, that how can it be me'akev over here? How can it be that if Rashi says that the phenomenon is Zek Heliv Anvehu, that's really the source? So how by Lulav can it be that if it's not Yavesh, that if it's Yavesh, then it's possible? Right, very nice. What we've been saying so far, Tamir, you there?
Yeah.
What we've been saying so far is that there's a halacha of the gavra, right? And as long as it's not a sha'as hadchak, if it's like a regular situation where you can get, there's multiple lulavim and good lulavim are available. So in terms of the requirement of the gavra, if you could get a not dry lulav, but you're irresponsible and you take a dry lulav, so even though lulav, the only halacha which is really present and manifest is the requirement on the gavra, so you're not Yotzei then, right? Even though there's no psul in the chefza issue by lulav. The only thing there is the requirement of the gavra to take a beautiful lulav, right? So then if you don't take a beautiful lulav, but you could, but it was available to you, so now you're not Yotzei because the gavra didn't fulfill his responsibility, right? That's what we've been saying, right? So that's fine, conceptually and logically, that makes sense. But if your source is Zek Heliv Anvehu, you still have to explain to me how it's the case all of a sudden now that Zek Heliv Anvehu is a me'akev halacha. Right? Normally in the Torah, you guys know the word ma'akev? Or ma'akev means that it means without it it's no good. It means it's absolutely necessary. Right? So all of a sudden over here, how can it be that Zek Heliv Anvehu is a completely necessary thing when everywhere else in the Torah it's not necessary? Very nice conceptually, we've explained how it makes sense in our Svara when we were going through the Rambam, but in terms of Rashi and using the source of Zek Heliv Anvehu, that's never ever a ma'akev requirement, Zek Heliv Anvehu. So all of a sudden here, how does it become such? Okay, you know what I'm asking? Pause it? Okay. The one other question I'll ask is that, once we take this step and we go with this approach that you guys are going with, is still, so what does it mean? How does Rashi deal with the Gemara, which says that the requirement for a lulav to be beautiful comes from Priyei Tadar? Right? Because if we're saying that the Priyei Tadar is really the requirement in the chefza, that the chefza be beautiful, and the Gemara is bringing that phenomenon over to Lulav, and it says that there's a hekesh, there's a connection between them, but we said at the end of the day, there's no manifestation of the halacha of a psul and a chefza by Lulav, right? So what's the Gemara doing? You know what I'm asking?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I think we need to sharpen up those points. I think we're going in the direction, we're on the path now, but I think we got to kind of sharpen it up what we're trying to say. Okay? So Yaakov points out that by Lulav, by the minim, by mitzvah's Lulav, Hidur is part of how did you put it? I think it was part of the formulation of the mitzvah, right? Which I think is true. We definitely see that because it is necessary, and without it, you haven't really fulfilled your mitzvah. But then the question sort of rolls back on us, because then we can say, if that's true, you'd think that when there's a special halacha by this mitzvah in particular, you'd think that you should learn out from a pasuk by this mitzvah. You shouldn't learn it out from the pasuk by the general principle in Kol HaTorah Kula. You know what I mean? Especially where you're treating that principle inconsistent with the way you treat it everywhere else. Everywhere else you say it's not ma'akev, here you say it is ma'akev. So it's very nice to say that over here it's part of the essential formulation, but then why wouldn't you use a pasuk from Lulav? You know what I mean? Sort of?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Okay.
Right?
So Yaakov points out, and I think it's a good important step. He says that it could be that Rashi's saying that Rashi's bringing in Zekeli Vanveyu and tells you that the requirement for Hiddur here from Zekeli Vanveyu. So Yaakov's proposing that he's not saying that it exists in the same way that Zekeli Vanveyu exists in the rest of the Torah, but that basically Zekeli Vanveyu is sort of qualifying HaTorah. I think that's a good logical maneuver and a good option that we should try to avail ourselves of. But I think it sort of still begs a certain amount of understanding, though, because it's still a little strange that you can say that that's true, but it's a little odd that according to Rashi, the Torah sort of uses this principle from the whole Torah. The Torah uses this principle from the Kol Torah Kula, which exists as a standalone halacha in all other mitzvahs, and here it just comes in as a qualifier of HaTorah. That's a little strange. So I don't think it's untrue. I think it's a good step, but I think we need to kind of flesh it out a little bit and see how it fits here. You know what I mean? All right, so we're going to move forward. I'm going to kind of say how I want to approach it, and it's pretty much in line with I think a lot of the things that the guys have said so far. So maybe just sort of a little more robust or whatever, but I think it's in the same direction. So let me ask you like this. Let's take a step backwards out of Rashi for 1 second and pretend that we're not thinking about Rashi at all. Let's just go back to the Rambam, okay, that we did yesterday, right? So we said that according to the Rambam, there's phenomenon of the chefza, psul and the chefza of Hiddur, and also a requirement for the Gavra to use the thing that's Hiddur, right? So according to the Rambam, and let's try and not be influenced by Rashi. So what would you say is the source for those phenomena? The requirement of the chefza and the requirement of the Gavra. Right, and we said that it's because mitzvahs lulav is because it's an avoda, so you need to do it in the way, in a manner which is beautiful and proper, and also you need to bring a thing which is beautiful and proper because it's a procedure of service. It's a ma'aseh avoda. So what would you say is the source in the Torah if you didn't know anything else?
Besides that the Torah says HaTorah?
No, the Torah says HaTorah.
So
HaTorah, right? That's what. If you want to go straight, that's what we would say, right? And you would say the HaTorah basically teaches you that mitzvahs lulav requires hiddur. Now, what are the frameworks for mitzvahs for hiddur in mitzvahs lulav according to the Rambam? There are two of them. What are they? One is the framework of the chefza, right? And the psul and the chefza, and the other is the requirement of the gavra. Now, is there anything wrong? Is there any problem with saying that both of those things are learned out from HaTorah?
A little strange.
Why is it a little strange?
We like one from one.
It's true, but I'll tell you, it's a good thought, but I think in truth this is one. Basically, it's saying that mitzvahs lulav requires hiddur. Now, how does it play out? Because mitzvahs lulav is an avoda, is a service, so that hiddur manifests in two different ways. One is in the gavra and one is in the chefza. So in a sense, really, it's teaching you one thing, but there's two different forms because in mitzvahs lulav, it's appropriate to have both of those forms, as we discussed yesterday. You know what I'm saying?
So really chefza and gavra are connected.
Yeah, meaning they're all stemming from the requirement of hiddur and mitzvahs lulav. And yesterday we explained why that requirement of hiddur and mitzvahs lulav should play out in both of these frameworks, right? Because of the idea that lulav is an avoda, right? Because it's asking for ritzui, for God's grace on the water and on the rain. And we pointed out that you're waving it the same way you wave a carbon. Like we brought a few different rayas that lulav is really an avoda, right?
Ritzui means what?
Ritzui means, it's a really good question. Ritzui means, let's call it, that God's will should be that in line with our need for rain. I mean, He provides the rain, and that His will is.
In general, that's what it means.
Ritzui basically means will. It's from the same word as ratzah, like to want something, like ani rotzah, So it means will. By God, it's always more complicated because what it means that when you talk about God's will is a more complicated thing. But that's basically what it means. So, but the point I'm making is right. You guys get the point I'm making, right? That lulav is an avoda, but the requirement for hiddur is one requirement just from HaTorah. Right? That means that mitzvahs dalad minim requires hiddur, and then it plays out in two frameworks as is appropriate here. Right? So far, so good?
Yeah.
Okay. So now let's go back to Rashi. So that's so the Rambam. The truth is, before we go back to Rashi, the Rambam doesn't really say what his pasuk that he learns from is. We're kind of supposing, but absent any other information, it seems the most straightforward to just say the Rambam is going straight with the Gemara's source, right? Which was HaTorah, was the source for hiddur, right? And now we've kind of what we've done in the last minute and a half is sort of conceptualized. We've formulated logically why that assumption is a good assumption, that his source straight up is HaTorah for both frameworks. Right? Agreed?
Yeah.
Okay. So now what's Rashi doing, right? So what you guys have been saying is that maybe Rashi is bringing in Zekeli Vanveyu to teach you the Gavra aspect, right? And that as opposed to what we're proposing is the Rambam, where he learns both of them from HaTorah, Rashi, we're saying, maybe brings in Zekeli Vanveyu to teach you the Gavra aspect of the requirement, that the Gavra has to bring a beautiful Balmina, right? Beautiful Lulav, right? Okay. So what we said is that it's a little funny that it sort of brings in sort of this principle from Kol HaTorah Kula and applies it in this sort of funny, strange way. And Yaakov points out that what it seems to be doing is that it's qualifying in a way HaTorah using Zekeli Vanveyu. But how's it working is sort of what we need to explain. Okay? So here's what I'm proposing. Let me try to start off with a metaphor. I don't know if this is the best way to present it, but I'm hoping that maybe it is, and if it isn't, then we'll try a different way. But I'm going to try to use a metaphor to get to the idea. All right, so here's the metaphor that I want to try to give. So I have friends who make chicken. They cook it, right, in multiple different ways. And one of the types of chicken that they make is it's coated on the outside with cornflakes. You guys ever see chicken like that? Ever have it? It's good? Okay. So when you make that type of chicken, it's called cornflake chicken, right? Do you make the cornflakes from scratch, or do you just take a box of cornflakes and put them on the outside?
It's a modifier.
Do you take the cornflakes from scratch? Just hear me out, because it's a little more sophisticated than that. But I mean, you're right. You see where I'm going. But so you could do either way. You could make it from scratch. Most people don't. I'm sure you could. There's a way to make cornflakes. Or you could just take a box of cornflakes, pour them on, and you're just basically bringing in cornflakes and using them in your recipe. Right? You follow?
Yeah.
Okay. So over here, by this mitzvah, so we've been saying there's a requirement of the Gavra to bring a beautiful mitzvah, right? To bring a beautiful lulav, because of the idea of avoda, right? That it's a type of avoda, right? Now, in terms of a Torah system, when God set up the Torah system, I could see two different ways that you say that the Gavra is required to do the mitzvah in a beautiful way, right? One way is to say that there's a new halacha by mitzvahs lulav, right? We know there's certainly a new halacha by lulav that the chefza of the lulav has to be beautiful. That's a halacha that's specific to this mitzvah, right? The chefza shel lulav has its own requirements, and saying that it's beautiful is one of them. So the phenomenon of the hidur and the chefza is its own thing. It's unique to mitzvahs lulav, right? Make sense? But now there's another halacha of the gavra has to bring a beautiful lulav. So there are two ways you could theoretically formulate it. You could say that by mitzvahs lulav, there's a kind of a newly created phenomenon that the chefza shel lulav has to be beautiful. You could also say that there's a newly created phenomenon, unique to mitzvahs lulav, that the gavra who does mitzvahs lulav has to do it in a beautiful way. But that this halacha is its own thing. It's like a halacha specific to lulav. Just like there's a phenomenon that lulav has to be mehudar, and there's a phenomenon that lulav has to be a certain shear, and there's a phenomenon of waving the lulav. There's all these halachas specific to lulav. So you could also say that the Torah, God created a halacha as part of the formulation of lulav, that the gavra has to do it in a beautiful way. Right? You follow that? Make sense? Okay. Alternatively, you could say that what the Torah did is it said, what God did, the Torah did is it said, well, we know that we're going to need these two. We're going to have these two requirements of the chefza needing hidur and the gavra needing hidur, right? Because of the idea of avodah we've been saying, right? But rather than newly creating the requirement for the gavra to do the mitzvah in a beautiful way, we'll grab the pre-existing category that exists in the rest of the Torah of zekeli vanveyu, which is a requirement for the gavra to do mitzvahs in a beautiful way, and we'll say that in this case, by mitzvahs lulav, you have to apply that category, and that over here it's ma'akev. But what it's basically doing is it's saying it's importing a category that already exists and applying it to this formulation. Just like when you make the cornflake chicken, you're taking cornflakes which already exist and just applying them to the chicken, when just using them in the recipe. Here it's basically saying, rather than create a new requirement for the gavra to do the mitzvah in a hidur way, rather than creating that requirement from scratch, it already exists in the whole Torah. Now it's true that in the whole Torah, you don't need it for any mitzvah. It doesn't ruin your mitzvah. It's not a psul. It's not me'akev a mitzvah. And here it has to. Here our formulation dictates that it has to be. But we're going to take this ingredient that exists in the whole Torah, we're going to import it and apply it in a way. And the Torah says over here it's me'akev. But conceptually, there are two ways that the Torah could formulate the requirement for the gavra here. It could create it anew in its own way, or it could import something that exists already. And I could see appeals to both sides. You guys follow what I'm trying to say, or not really? Yeah? And you can see appeals both ways. So basically what we're trying to say is, Rashi's saying it's importing the category from Kol HaTorah Kula and applying it, and making it over here, making it Ma'akev. But it's the same formulation as everything we've been saying till now, that it's a requirement for the Gavra to do the mitzvah in a beautiful way. But that the way the Torah formulated that requirement by Lulav, rather than creating the category anew from scratch, right, so to speak, rather than creating the cornflakes, from nothing, since it already exists in the whole Torah, it just grabs onto it and brings it over here. So, right? And you can see appeals to both ways, conceptually, I think. Right? On the one hand, if you go the Rambam's way, what we're saying is the Rambam's way, right? And you say that even the Gavra side of this thing is learned out from Priyat Hadar, right? So that is an appeal, because you're saying that the mitzvah has a certain consistency to it. Both of the aspects of Hiddur are both learned out from the same place and in the same way. So it's consistent and it's smooth. You know what I mean? Sort of? Tell me here. No? Should I say that point again?
Yeah.
I'm trying to, right? Do you get the point that I'm saying till now about the two different ways, like the cornflake metaphor, right? Where you could either create it anew or import a pre-existing thing?
Okay.
So I could see appeals to both ways, right? I could see an appeal to creating the category as a new thing in special to mitzvahs lulav of the Gabra has to do mitzvahs lulav in a way that's hiddur. And I could see an appeal to the Torah doing it in a way where it's not a new special category by lulav of a Gabra doing mitzvahs lulav in a hiddur way, but rather the Torah saying you have to do mitzvahs in ways that are mahudar. It's a general thing, and I'm bringing it in over here and importing it and applying it in a way that's ma'akev. I could see appeals both ways. So now I'm trying to explain the appeals. Okay. So the appeal that I could see of creating a new category by mitzvahs lulav, of that the Gabra has to do it in a way that's mehudar, that is hidur, is that then you're basically treating it in a way that's entirely parallel to the requirement of hidur in the chefza, right? There's a requirement of hidur in the chefza, that's a halacha that's unique and specific to lulav. And now you're saying the requirement for the Gavra to do it in a way that's mehudar, that is hidur, is also unique and specific to mitzvahs lulav. So the requirement of hidur in the chefza and for the Gavra are basically being structured in a way that's parallel and equal. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Make sense, Yaakov?
One question.
Okay, but I'll say the other side. But you sort of get what I'm saying?
General topic.
Okay. You want me to stop, or you want me to just finish and then come back to it?
You can stop.
I should stop.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I'll take a pause. Do you know you got what I'm saying?
Kinda,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let's interrupt for a question.
Yeah. What would be the nafkamina?
Between Rashi and the Rambam?
No, what you're saying. Are they creating a new?
Okay, let me come back. Okay. Let me say the appeal of the other side. Okay.
There is.
Okay. So let me just say the appeal of the other side. So do you see the appeal of this one side, where kind of right, where how they're both the Gavra phenomenon and the Chefza phenomenon of Hiddur?
Parallel structure.
Yeah, correct. You see that?
Wait,
sort of maintaining a certain parallel structure, he said.
Okay.
Where in mitzvahs lulav, certainly the requirement for the chefza to be mehudar, we've been saying, is a phenomenon that's unique to lulav, right? It's not imported from anywhere in the Torah, it's something specific to lulav. And if you say that the requirement for the Gavra to do it in a way that has hidur is also unique to lulav, then they're treated the same way, it's parallel. Okay? Yaakov, I'm not sure I'm seeing that you're seeing it. Should I say it differently?
Well, I don't see that makes any difference.
In terms, practically?
Yeah.
Like what's the nafkamina?
Also conceptually.
Conceptually. The difference between importing it versus not importing it?
Yeah.
Okay, but let me think how to say it. Give me a second. Okay, so why would I see an appeal to one way or the other? So I'm just going to reiterate. So the one way of saying where it's a newly created thing in mitzvahs lulav, it's not making use of a pre-existing Torah category of Zekeli Anveyo, right? The way that we're sort of saying the Rambam is going, that it's just created, the requirement of the Gavra by lulav, it's a newly created thing. Special halacha by lulav. Newly created. The Gavra has to do it in a way that's mehudar. So what's the advantage of that? So what's the advantage of that? Yaakov, you with me?
Yeah.
So what's the advantage of that? So we've been saying. The advantage of that is that then the construction of the requirement in the Gavra is being done in an entirely parallel way to the requirement of Hiddur and the Chefza. The requirement of Hiddur and the Chefza is a uniquely created thing for Lulav. It's a new halacha in Lulav, right? It doesn't exist elsewhere in the Torah. Lulav has to be Mehudar in the Chefza. Okay? So that's uniquely created by Lulav. So similarly, the requirement that the Gavra has to do it in the way that's Mehudar is also uniquely created. So they're working in a parallel way. So that's the advantage of doing it that way. Okay?
Parallel meaning what?
Meaning, just like one is newly created, the other is newly created. They're symmetrical. They're structurally symmetrical and consistent.
Right.
Okay? Which wouldn't be the case if it imported from the rest of the Torah. Because if you import the requirement in the Gavra from the general Torah principle of Zakei Levan Veyu, So then that's imported from a general Torah principle, whereas the requirement in the Hefza is a newly created thing. So now they're not symmetrical anymore. Okay? But there is an advantage to doing it that way. On the other hand, what's the advantage of doing it that other way? It's almost what we can call like a law of conservation of structures.
Right.
Where rather, if you don't need to create a new structure, then why would you? It already exists in the rest of the Torah, so you can just import it. Now, why you'd say, why is one of those things better than the other? I don't know. Which is better? That's up to your own mind. According to Rashi thought it was more appealing to say that it just imported it because you can conserve the structures. Whereas the Rambam would say, no, you don't import it, then it's not consistent. Then it's not a parallel symmetrical structure, so it's better to say that it's newly created. But you see the two different sort of appeals to both sides? Why I'd say one way or the other?
Are you surprised Rama went that second road? I'd say it's YBT-ish, or let's say the tendency of the tendency of conceptual thinkers is to have a cyclical aversion to Rashi's or to Rambam's derech in this. We generally don't like to create new things. We're very down to we'd much rather have something be in potentia that gets actualized in a certain place than to be completely created. And
that's true.
So I'm very interested, on the face I made is because I'm very interested that the Rambam ended up being that one of the created.
I hear you, but on the other hand,
Rambam-ish.
conceptual thinkers also like consistency. You know what I mean?
So
in the Rambam, we're saying the structure is consistent. It's parallel.
True, but in this case, the meta one is being forsaken for the sake of the prat. So
I don't know which one you'd call a meta and which one you'd call a prat. But I hear you. I mean, it seems like to your mind.
I see.
Right. What I'm concluding from you is that to your mind, one seems more like conceptually beautiful and sort of fundamental than the other.
No, just for me, the Rambam seems to. I'm really making a judgment call from YBT. Though YBTs are these representatives of Rambam. That I think if we get a YBT poll right now,
are we getting a little bit of a tangent here?
Yeah, well, YBT would pick Rashi. There'd be over 50.01%.
I think what we're saying is basically that to your mind, based on your knowledge
I don't know if there's a projection. I think this is an accurate,
right, either way.
I think it's an accurate judgment call.
It could be. All right, either way. This is sort of a different type of discussion.
Okay.
But you could certainly see the logics of both sides, right?
I see.
Yeah. You know what I'm saying, Yaakov? Sort of see it?
I'm still a bit bothered though. It seems it's like a big, semantic conceptual game.
Yeah, there's no whole lot.
What do you mean by that? Oh, you mean by the fact that there's no nafkamina?
Conceptual semantics, basically.
By conceptual semantics, do you mean that there's no nafkamina or you mean something else?
Yeah.
There's an abstract nafkamina, huh?
No, there's no abstract nafkamina.
Yeah, there is. I mean,
at the end of the day,
one exists and potentially one doesn't.
No, I'm saying at the end of the day, what is the mitzvah lulav? It's still.
You think Lamaisa?
Well, at the end of the I'll tell you, Yaakov. Practically, I don't know if there's a difference.
It makes a difference in abstract.
You don't think it makes a difference conceptually?
If something exists,
the end abstract.
If something exists outside of something else, and something doesn't exist outside of something else, is that not a difference?
And so what?
If something exists outside of something else,
no,
that's situation A. Situation A is this fist exists outside. This hand exists outside of this hand. And situation B is this hand does not exist. Is that a difference?
You input to the actual terms, yeah.
Can you just deal with that question? Are those two?
I think we all agree that's those are two different
obvious.
things. But the question is whether that
affects. Same thing. I mean, I don't know. Again, I don't know. The cornflake. Like, does the cornflakes already exist in the cupboard, or do they not? Those are two different situations. Now, I agree with you that I mean it's not as different as you'd like, because at the end of the day, the question they both become attached to it. So at a certain point in time, they both leave the same place. But is there an element of the situation that renders them different? And yes, is there a halakha enough for me to know? But
yeah, I mean I don't know if there's a halakha enough for me.
It doesn't sound like
doesn't sound like there is. I agree.
I don't even feel it affects the abstraction of love.
Okay, but
I mean the love is based off the abstraction, but I don't think the abstraction is affected.
Well, it depends what you mean by when you say the abstraction isn't affected, because the way that this mitzvah is formulated is certainly different.
The halachic, what is it? I don't know, formulation, well, I guess.
Yeah.
It's still the same.
See, that I would disagree with, because I would say in one case, well, again, it depends what you mean. If you mean that in either way you go, the gavra needs to bring a beautiful lulav, then you're right. But the structure, the construction of that requirement isn't the same. Because do we mean, when we say the gavra has to bring a beautiful lulav, do we mean the gavra has to bring a beautiful lulav because of zekili vanveyu, which is imported to over here? Or do we mean that the gavra has to bring a beautiful lulav because there's a special halacha by lulav like that?
Is either path any more logical than the other?
I would say no. But they are two different ideas.
But it's kind of just like aesthetics almost.
I don't know if I would call it aesthetics. I would call it two different structures. Now, I'll put it this way. According to Rashi, one way was more appealing than the other. There's a reason he went the way he did, not the other. And we tried to explain why, an appeal of each side. And you can see an appeal to each side. At the end of the day, see, I think maybe what's confusing this, I'm not sure if this is kind of the point that's going on in your mind. Maybe what makes it a little tricky is that there's sort of different levels of logical construction.
They both
When we say that we could say that what's the logical structure of Lulav? It's that there's a psul of Hiddur in the Chefza and also a requirement of Hiddur from the Gavra. Now, in that sense, if you just stop there, they're exactly the same. Rashi and the Rambam both saying the same thing. But the question is, when we say, but you can understand it deeper, when we say that there's a requirement of Hiddur from the Gavra, what is that requirement? Is that an imported requirement from Zekedi Van Vehu that's rendered Me'akev over here in order to, like we said, a conservation of categories? Or is that a newly created thing, a requirement of Hiddur from the Gavra, and we said the appeal of that side is that it's inconsistent with the Chefza requirement. But to my mind at least, those strike me as two different abstract formulations.
Well, could you just ask who cares?
What do you mean by that?
And why you say to go one or the other?
Why would you say one or the other? Well, that's what we tried to explain before. I
understand one's parallel, one's consistent,
right. But why would you choose parallelism versus conservation?
Yeah, I don't see any effects, really.
But let me clarify your question for myself. Are you asking why you would choose parallelism versus why you would choose conservation, or are you asking what's the impact of choosing one, or are you asking what's the effect, what's the difference that emerges from choosing one versus choosing the other?
Probably more the latter.
More the latter. So again, practically, there may not be a difference. But the question is, what is the formulation here? The point is that, I think the point that it comes down to is that we all agree the Torah should be, the premise of this year is that the Torah is formulated in a logical, categorical way. Right? And I think that the categorization, when the Rishonim approach the sugya, they say, what's the categorization? And each one is looking for the most consistent, and I would say almost the most appealing and beautiful formulation. And each one, and intuitively appealing. And each one sees certain concepts and categories as being a more appropriate way that the Torah would construct it. And to Rashi's mind, one way was more appropriate and one way was more appealing. And you could even say one way was more aesthetically beautiful, conceptually beautiful. And the Rambam, another way was more conceptually beautiful. Now, which way the Torah, which way it's formulated, that's subject to machlokas. But we can at least see both sides, and seeing both sides, we're learning Torah the whole time. Rashi's Torah is Torah, the Rambam's Torah is Torah. But they are two different ideas. They're definitely, to my mind, two different ideas here. You know what I mean? You want me to, Yaakov?
By two ideas, you mean?
I mean that the logical, conceptual, we're using these words over and over, right? The conceptual formulation of the two conceptual formulations implement different concepts.
Well, okay, I guess as I'm saying, the origins are different, but the actual formulation is the same.
So I think at a certain point, this might be coming down to a semantic question.
Right.
Because what I'm saying that whether it's a newly created thing versus whether it's an imported from the rest of the Torah thing, that's part of the formulation. And maybe you're saying that's sort of the origin, but the formulation at the end of the day is requirement of Hiddur and the Gavra. But I think we can use it like a generic term. There certainly are two different ideas here. Whether we call the idea the formulation or whether we call the idea the origin of the formulation, there are two different ideas in play here, depending which way you go.
Right.
So that I think is the important thing. How we label it, I think, is less important, whether it's the formulation or the origin of the formulation. As long as your mind sees two different ideas, I would be happy if I were you.
Are these people here starting from either parallelism or the other option?
Right, conservation of...
Or are you looking backwards at it?
When you say these people, you mean like Rashi and the Rambam?
Yeah.
Are you asking whether, when they approach this sugya,
they're already biased?
They already know one of those two things is more important?
Yeah, is just doing that, or just they looked at it and went backwards?
I think it's more likely they looked at it and they said, well, how is this, what's the structure here? How is it formulated? And then one of those ideas hit their mind more strongly than the other. So they went with it. It seems to me how it probably works.
Right. Okay.
A little clearer, maybe?
Well, I get what you're saying, I just still bothering me.
Still bothering. Okay, so maybe think a little more. We could discuss a little bit after. Dylan, did you have something you wanted to say? Or?
The reason why you didn't want to say chalk it up to just aesthetics, because the idea is because in Talmudic Judaism we like to say.
Should I pause the tape?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, now you.
Okay, so let's just round out what we're left with, right? So let's just see how this answers the questions, right? So we had two questions on Rashi. One question is, how can Rashi argue with the Gemara? The Gemara says the source is Pri Eitz, and Rashi says the source is Zekei Livan Vehu. So I think the way that we answer that question, with everything we've said, is like this. When the Gemara says that the requirement of Hiddur in the Lulav is Zekei Livan Vehu, so I think this is sort of speaks to and ties to what Yaakov was saying earlier. That's sort of like the generic requirement of Hiddur. That the pasuk says Zekei Livan. Sorry, I may have misspoken. When the pasuk says Pri Eitz, if I said Zekei Livan Vehu before, then I was wrong. So when the pasuk says Pri Eitz, that's the Gemara's pasuk, right? And then it is a hekesh over to Lulav. So that's the source of Hiddur, the phenomenon of Hiddur, right? But now the question is, how does that Hiddur manifest itself? So according to Rashi, that Hiddur manifests itself vis-a-vis if you just had that pasuk, that Hiddur would manifest itself simply in terms of the requirement in the Chefza. Okay? Pri Eitz, it's talking about the entity, right? To tell you that, and to introduce the requirement of the Hiddur and the Gavra, so Rashi's saying, under the umbrella of the general requirement of Hiddur, which Pri Eitz tells you about, now you have two different Hiddurs, right? Two frameworks. The Chefza emerges straight from that pasuk, right? The pasuk implies a Hiddur in the Chefza, Pri Eitz. But the Hiddur that the Gavra needs to maintain, that comes from importing and making use of a pre-existing category of Zekei Livan Vehu. So it's not inconsistent with the Gemara, because when the Gemara makes the hekesh, it's telling you about the general phenomenon of Hiddur. But now in terms of the specific formulation of the Hiddur and the Gavra, so that it imports from the pre-existing category of Zekei Livan Vehu. And we've explained what the appeal is of going that way as opposed to saying that it's newly created. Okay? Right? Good? Yeah? Tamir? Yaakov, I know you're still a little bothered, but in terms of that question, makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay. David, you hanging in there?
For some reason, my mind's with the Rabbi right now.
Oh, okay. All right.
So I made a good step earlier.
So be a little patient. Yes, absolutely. All right, so and now in terms of the other question, right? So that's one of the questions that Tosfos had on Rashi, right? The other question was, how can you tell me that Zekei Livan Vehu, in general, the whole Torah, it's always, it's never Ma'akev. So all of a sudden here it's Ma'akev. So we're explaining that over here, it's not simply that you have Zekei Livan Vehu just comes in the way it does in the rest of the Torah. The real thing here, really what's going on here is that you have a phenomenon of Hiddur as told by Pri Eitz. But then within that phenomenon, the Torah makes use of the category of Zekei Livan Vehu and applies it in a way that's Ma'akev. So if it was simply that you had Zekei Livan Vehu here the same way you did everywhere else, then Tosfos' question would be a good question. How all of a sudden is it Ma'akev over here? Right? But since over here we're saying that Pri Eitz creates a general requirement of Hiddur, but that then Rashi makes use of Zekei Livan Vehu simply by importing a pre-existing category. So when you import that pre-existing category, now you can use it and tell it, and the Torah can tell you that pre-existing category applies in a way that's Ma'akev. But that pre-existing category is functioning in a new way. It's not functioning the way it does in the rest of the Torah. You know what I'm trying to say? Okay, I'm going to say the last part one more time. So when we were trying to answer Tosfos' other question of Zekei Livan Vehu in general is never Ma'akev, right? You guys remember we talked about the word Ma'akev, it means it's absolutely necessary. So Zekei Livan Vehu is never Ma'akev in the whole Torah. If you have to make a Sefer Torah in a nice way, but if you don't, it's still fine. So it's never Ma'akev. How over here, all of a sudden, can it be Ma'akev? That was Tosfos' question on Rashi, right, Dylan? Yeah. Okay. So the way we're answering it is like this. We're saying that in general, Zekei Livan Vehu is not Ma'akev. It's true. And if over here it was simply that Zekei Livan Vehu existed the way it always exists, then Tosfos' question would be a good question. How can it all of a sudden be Ma'akev? It's not Ma'akev anywhere else, right? But we're saying here that what the Torah did, what God did, is that it took the principle of Zekei Livan Vehu and it imported it and applied it over here in service of the general framework of Hiddur, right? Now, when you're importing that principle and applying it in this specific case, you can apply it in any way you want. So you can apply it in a way that's Ma'akev, even though it's not Ma'akev anywhere else. But Tosfos' premise, when he asks this question, is that Zekei Livan Vehu exists the way it does everywhere else, but it's not true. It's being imported and applied here to teach you, applied here to introduce the phenomenon of Hiddur and the Gavra in service of the general requirement of Hiddur that the Pri Eitz tells you that you need. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah? Sort of?
It's not completely imported though. You're still attaching the market.
Correct. That's a good point. That's an important point to make. You're right. It's not simply that it's just brought over and applied here regularly. Because if it were completely imported, what you'd basically be saying is it applies here the way it applies everywhere else. You wouldn't need to import it. It would just exist because it always exists. It exists in all the mitzvahs. When you're importing it here, you must be doing something special because Otherwise, you would need to import it.
So you are making it specific to Lulav.
In a sense, yes. Yeah, that's true. But not that it's not newly created for Lulav. When you take the cornflakes, you're not just eating cornflakes, you're putting them on the chicken.
It's ma'akev and potential for everything, but it's actualized for Lulav.
I don't know if that's a helpful point. But
Why not?
Because it's not ma'akev and potential.
I'm trying to get out of this imported problem because it's really not imported then.
But it is important.
But it's not because then if it's imported, it's like everything else. So
What I'm saying is that if it's imported, it must be that it's not like everything else. Otherwise, there would be no need to import it.
No, but you're saying it with the ma'akev. That's a new creation, like you just said. If it was really just purely imported, there'd be more to be ma'akev.
What I'm saying, the point I'm making is like this: the phenomenon of the requirement of the gavra is not newly created. Yeah, the Torah, introduces a new element to it, but it's not newly created. It applies it in a way that's ma'akev. But it definitely is Rashi's saying it's bringing it in a pre-existing thing.
The question is, where does ma'akev come from? So I thought myself, 20 minutes. Right. I think your easy way out is to say it's en potentia ma'akev for everybody.
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that. I think that's
okay. So then, how do you explain ma'akev?
I mean, the guy's pointing out a good important point that you can't simply say when we say. I tried to say, I was mentioning before that there must be something kind of different here about the application of Zekei Levan Vehu by Lulav. Otherwise, if it existed and the halachos associated with it were the same as all the other mitzvos, you wouldn't need to import it. It would just be there the way it exists in all the mitzvos. Right? But the guys are pointing out it's a good point that there is something new here by the Zekei Levan Vehu. The import of that being imported to Lulav does have a new element of ikuv. And Yaakov points out, and it's a good point, that apparently comes from the Lulav. The mitzvahs Lulav introduces the ikuv to it. Basically what it means is that God designed mitzvahs Lulav so that when it's imported into mitzvahs Lulav, for the sake of mitzvahs Lulav, it's ma'akev. That's basically what we're saying. So there's an aspect of it which is, so to speak, newly created, but the phenomenon isn't new. That's the important point here. There's an aspect which didn't exist everywhere else. The way that it's used is different, but the phenomenon as a phenomenon is the same thing. You know what I mean?
If the application of the phenomenon is new.
That's correct. Yeah. But that's not a new creation. That's just an application.
The result is exactly the same.
That's a point that we argued for about 20 minutes before.
Explain basically why.
Halakhically, there's no halachic nafkamina, I would say, but to my mind, and I think at a certain point, this might, like we said before, it might come down to a semantic question. I wouldn't say that the result is exactly the same, because ultimately the idea is two different ideas. Is the idea of the requirement of the gavra a newly created thing, or is it an imported thing? That to my mind is two different ideas.
I would agree.
And Dylan would agree.
I would agree, and I don't think that makes anyone more correct. But I do think to Plato that the justification, and I guess that the construction idea is a part of the idea, and you can't that the construction, that the underpinnings of an idea is part of the idea, and you can't just say because the top of the pyramid looks the same that also the bottom is the same. I don't hold that. You want to say because they all go to the same place, it's the same idea. No, I'm not holding that. Anyway.
All right. Either way. All right. Just a quick 1 minute summary, right? Just for the end of the recording, right? We had our four questions. Right, 2 regarding Rashi, 2 regarding the Rambam. Right, our basic approach was to try to explain Rashi through using the Rambam. The Rambam's idea, we said, was that in mitzvahs lulav, by all the minim, there are these 2 frameworks. There's the requirement of hidur in the chefza and in the gavra, but the requirement in the gavra exists by all 4. But the requirement in the chefza doesn't manifest by lulav. It exists in potential, but it isn't manifested because dryness physically affects the lulav differently than it affects the other minim. That explains why the Rambam treats lulav differently from the other 3. It also explains how you can have an exception in Shas Adchak, because in Shas Adchak there's no problem that for lulav there's no problem that the gavra violated his requirement for hidur because he did his best. And from there we went to Rashi and we said Rashi's introducing Zekei Levan Vehu because he holds, unlike the Rambam who holds that this requirement of hidur from the gavra is a newly created thing. We said that Rashi holds that the requirement for hidur from the gavra is imported and applied in a way that's ma'akev. It's imported and applied from the general principle in the Torah of Zekei Levan Vehu. So that explains how Rashi isn't really contradicting the Gemara in the source pasuk that he's using, and it explains how Rashi can use Zekei Levan Vehu in a way that's ma'akev. All right, so that's the shir, and thank you guys.